Hello, I'm Kevin. I'm one of the horticulturalists here at the Greenery Garden Home. And today's topic is on the safe use of herbicides in the home garden, both in garden beds and in lawn situations. And I'm going to talk about the different uses and practicalities for each type and the safe way to apply them in the home garden. With the various types of herbicides that are available these days, it can be quite confusing on picking the right one for the right situation in your home garden. They basically separate out into two main categories. There are those herbicides or weed killers used for controlling weeds in lawns, and then there's also those that are used in garden beds or in paved areas. And they are totally separate sort of herbicides, and we need to be conscious of not using the wrong type in the wrong situation. So I'll explain a few of the different types now, starting with those that are suitable for lawns. They're available in different formulations. So a lot of the gardeners may be aware of the general weed and feed type lawn weed killers. So the weed and feed, as the name suggests, are used for controlling weeds in lawns and also used for feeding the lawn at the same time. So they're convenient in the sense that they're doing two different things at once for those people that are time poor and would like a weed killer that's going to be effective and also help to feed the lawn at the same time. We need to be careful that we are using the right sort of weed killers for different types of grasses. Some lawns, for instance, like buffalo lawn, is sensitive to certain types of weed killers. So we need to make sure that we are buying those particular weed killers that can be safely used on buffalo lawns and not burn them in the process. This particular weed and feed is not suitable for buffalo lawns. It's fine for other types of grasses, but needs to be avoided in the use when we're trying to control weeds in buffalo lawns. I might add that most of the weed killers for lawns only control broadleaf weeds, what they call broadleaf weeds or flat weeds. They're not suitable for controlling grass type weeds in lawns. If they did, then they would also affect your grass, and obviously we don't want those sort of problems occurring. Weed and feed comes as a hose on formulation. This particular bottle clicks onto your garden hose, and it's applied over the lawn area, particularly where the weeds are. We need to avoid getting it onto garden beds that might be surrounding the lawn because it may potentially affect the plants in those garden beds. A bottle this size is going to cover around about 150 square metres, so they're quite economical and very effective in controlling the broadleaf weeds in lawns. Not suitable for buffalo grass. There is one that is formulated specifically for buffalo lawns. This is a buffalo weed and feed. The same application through the garden hose. As the chemical, as the hose draws the chemical out of the bottle, it mixes with the water as it goes through the hose, and this will treat, around about 120 to 130 square metres, and safe to use on your buffalo lawn, and also will feed at the same time. Both of the ones that I've mentioned are also available as granular applications. The weed and feed can be applied dry to the lawn, can either be broadcast by hand onto the lawn, or you can use a spreader type unit, which is quite easy to use. It tends to spread the granules evenly across the lawn surface. Again, you need to be conscious of garden beds around the lawn area, avoiding any plants that may be in those garden beds. The herbicide may affect those plants, so try to confine it just to the lawn areas. With it being a granular, it's worth wearing some sort of protective dust mask just to avoid inhaling any of those granules that might occur. It's a very effective herbicide. It does come with a feeder in it as well, so for the convenience sake of weeding and feeding at the same time. The best time to apply these is as the weeds are actively growing, which is generally towards the end of winter in Melbourne, early spring. Quite often what happens with lawns, particularly running type grasses like buffalo, they go dormant in the winter months, and the weeds tend to come in and invade the areas where there's not a lot of grass cover. So as the weeds are starting to actively grow, the herbicides are much more effective that time. With the strong growth in the weeds, they tend to absorb the herbicide a lot more effectively. So it goes on dry, a couple of days with no rain. If it hasn't rained after 2 days, then the herbicide needs to be watered in by hand. That helps to dissolve the fertiliser granules that are included in the bag and wash them down to the root system where the plant can use the fertiliser. So now in Melbourne, this is the end of winter, it's a good time to start applying those sort of weed killers. For those of you with larger areas and a more economical way of applying herbicides, this is a concentrated liquid herbicide. It can be used safely on all lawns. This is dissolved in water, generally in a watering can at the recommended rate, and applied to the weeds. It doesn't contain fertiliser, it's just a broadleaf weed killer, a selective broadleaf weed killer. It's not going to kill any of those grassy weeds that you may have, but it's effective in controlling the broadleaf type weeds or the flat weeds, which are very common at this time of the year. So that's a more economical way to apply it. That will cover at least 400 square metres, which is pretty good for a small bottle. For those of you who only have a occasional weed or the odd weed in the lawn, and you don't need to go to the extent of mixing up or hosing on herbicides, this is like a spot spray. It's not suitable for the use in buffalo lawns, but other types of grasses it's fine. If you have spot weeds like clover or dandelions coming up in the lawn, it's just a matter of going around and spraying those weeds individually. It's quick and effective, particularly if you haven't got a lot of weeds and you want quick action on them. Most of the weed killers for lawns that I've mentioned probably going to take at least a couple of weeks to kill off the weeds, so you may not notice any instant results, but over a period of time you'll find those weeds will yellow and brown off and wither, and if need be, if you've got large areas left over from when the weeds have died, you may have to install new grass seed or lay some instant turf just to fill in the patches. But to keep the weeds, keep the lawn looking good, it's worth keeping an eye on the weeds and controlling them as necessary. So I've mentioned briefly some of the weed killers that are suitable for lawn situations in the garden. I now want to talk about some other herbicides that can be used in garden beds or in gravel or paved areas, and they're a different type of herbicide and generally not recommended for lawns. These are what we call non-selective herbicides, meaning that they don't distinguish between a weed or a plant. So when we're using them in garden beds, we need to be conscious of not applying the herbicide to any desirable plants in the garden that we do want to keep. One of the safest ones, and an organic weed killer for those of you that don't like using chemicals, this is a product called Slasher, and it's quite a good knockdown spray for those odd weeds that you might get in garden beds or coming up in cracks of paving or in gravel areas or pebble areas. It's not great on persistent type weeds or those weeds that have an extensive root system. What it tends to do is burn off the leaves and may not necessarily kill those weeds that have got those really strong attributes. So if you've got the odd weed coming up in the garden, you want a safe herbicide to use. This is organic product and doesn't contain any chemicals that you might not like to use in the garden. It comes as a ready-to-use trigger pack. It's also available as a concentrate in a few different sizes, which you can dilute yourself. And they're particularly good if you've got large areas of weeds that you need to control. This is more of a quick knockdown type spray for those softer weeds that you might get coming up throughout the year. There's various types of weed killers which contain glyphosate, and the beauty of glyphosate, it's a very effective weed killer on a whole range of weeds in the garden. Again, you need to be conscious of not getting it onto any desirable plants, spraying it directly onto the weeds. They don't persist in the soil after you've sprayed. They tend to break down very quickly in the soil, but they may do damage to plants that they come in contact with if you accidentally happen to spray those plants. So it's sold in various brands. Zero is one, Roundup is another. They are safe to use in the garden, providing they're used correctly, and very effective in a whole range of weeds. Can be used safely on paths or gravel or pebbles, as I've mentioned before. In garden beds, you just need to be conscious of not spraying onto any of the plants that you may want to keep. They all come either ready to use. You can buy them as concentrates if you've got larger areas to cover. Again, you dilute in water at the recommended rates and spray accordingly. With any herbicides, it's worth considering the weather when you are spraying. Obviously, if you apply these on a day where there's rain forecast, the rain tends to dilute the product. So probably allow, say, 12 hours of drying time once the herbicide's been applied. That way it's going to be more effective. If it does rain after you've applied it within a 12-hour period, there's a risk of it diluting and not being so effective, and you may have to do it again. So a bright sunny day, avoid you know, maybe spraying on those other plants, as I mentioned, that you want to keep. Probably worth wearing some rubber gloves when you're spraying any weed killers, just to avoid getting it on your hands. But otherwise very effective. So there's glyphosate is the name of the active ingredient, and it comes either sold as Zero or Roundup, ready to use, or as concentrates, which you can mix up yourself. This is one way of saving your back when you're controlling weeds, particularly in, say, a path or driveway situation, or even amongst shrubs in the garden. This is a brush on a hollow pole. So the weed killer is actually poured into the pole, and the brush is dabbed on. The liquid goes through the pole and into the brush, and then you dab the weeds with the brush individually. So it's a fairly safe way to avoid getting it on any of those plants in the garden that you don't want to risk getting the spray on. And it also saves your back because you don't have to bend over when you're trying to kill the weeds. So a concentrated solution is poured into the tube and then diluted with water, and then the brush can be dabbed onto individual weeds. So look out for that one. It's quite an effective way for controlling weeds in garden beds or in driveway sort of situations. It's called the Zero weeding brush. So I hope that's helped you with selecting the right sort of herbicide for your garden situation. If you have any other queries, feel free to ask any of the horticultural staff here at the Greenery Garden Home. We're only happy to help. We're open 6.5 days a week, and we can help you with other plant queries or any other garden queries that you may have. Thanks for watching.